All right, well, I'll go ahead and get started. Welcome. My name is Dr. Richard Martinez. I'm a psychologist and also the coordinator for prevention and outreach at the Counseling Center here at Texas State. And I'll be talking today about supporting first-generation college students' mental health and well-being. This is a topic that's very important to me. So I also identify as a first-generation college student. So a lot of these experiences that I'll be talking about today mirror some of my own experiences I had as an undergrad and also throughout graduate school. And this will be our final webinar of the fall 2020 webinar series, but we'll be building a spring webinar series shortly, with plenty of timely and pertinent topics. A closed captioned recording of this webinar will be archived on the Counseling Center's website, as well as all of the other webinars that we've conducted over this past summer and this fall. There'll also be a short survey that you'll be directed to at the end of this webinar, and we'd really appreciate your feedback, as that'll help us generate those topics for future webinars. So to tell you a little bit more about this webinar in particular, what I'll be going over is some unique challenges and considerations in supporting the mental health, well-being, and the academic success of first-generation college students. I'll also talk about some recommendations and strategies to build a supportive and inclusive environment for first-gen college students here at Texas State. I'll try to reserve as much time as possible at the end of this presentation for any questions that you might have. If you could take just a moment to familiarize yourself with the features of the Zoom webinar, if you'll notice there are, you have the ability to use the chat function, which is like the chat box. And I'd ask for you to use that just if you are responding to any questions that I pose as part of the presentation. But if you have any questions for me specifically, I would encourage you to use the Q&A feature, which is just labeled Q&A. And that keeps the questions nice and organized for me. And I saw a hand go up, so if you want to go ahead and use the Q&A or the chat for your question, we'll be sure to do that. And I'm being assisted by Eli Miller, our graduate assistant, who will help me cover some of the chat as well as I'm presenting. All right, so I will go ahead and move forward. And if you could use the chat function briefly, I'd like to have just a kind of a quick show of hands using the chat if there's any first generation college students in the audience. So this is faculty or staff who they themselves were once a first gen college student. If you could just type in me into the box, that way I get a sense of whether there's other folks out there listening who this may particularly relate to. Okay, starting to see some responses. Okay, so at least 3 of us, or 3 additional folks in addition to me, are first-gen college students. So thank you for sharing that. To get a sense, I'll get started by just talking about kind of why this population is important and who first-generation college students are. So this population is important just sheerly because of the size of who first-generation college students are. So the latest statistics I found from 2014 estimated that 34% of nationwide of universities' freshman population are first-generation college students. And this population actually has the highest dropout rates of any population in higher education. When we think about first-generation college students, there's not like one defining factor or identity that kind of like succinctly summarizes who a first-generation college student is. They're actually a pretty diverse group. Like there's so many different intersecting identities in addition to that, the variable of just not having parents who finished a degree. So what I've seen in the research and the literature is that first generation college students are more likely to be students of color, They're also more likely to be children or a child of immigrants coming from a low SES background or low socioeconomic status background. They tend to be older than non-first generation college students. They're more likely to work full-time, and they're more likely to live off campus versus on campus. And as I was going through this webinar and researching for it, I just want to highlight that there's a huge need, especially in mental health research, to focus specifically on this population. It was kind of sad to see that this population is one that tends to feel and be invisible on campus, but to also see that replicated within the research was a bit disheartening. So I think there's a lot of opportunities for us to grow as a field and discipline to explore not just the risk factors, but also some of the strengths and the resiliencies of this population and how we can best serve them. Okay, let's move on and discuss some of the unique characteristics and challenges of first generation college students. These challenges and these unique characteristics, they can lead to unique counseling needs and mental health concerns that we don't necessarily see in non-first generation college students. And that relates to their academic functioning, their adjustment to college, their family of origin issues as well. The first thing that I wanted to highlight is, as I mentioned in the last slide, first generation college students are more likely to be employed, working multiple jobs or working full time, while also trying to support their family and trying to remain as self-sufficient as possible. So I read a lot in the research and the literature that this is a population who tends to be deeply involved within family. And so not just trying their best to not ask for money or support, picking up that extra job or two to try to make their own ends meet. But in addition, they're trying to send back or contribute as much as possible to their family back home. And this kind of lines up a lot with some of the stories I've heard in session where many of my students are actually expected and encouraged to share some of like their financial aid refund checks and things like that with the family to help pay rent or pay expenses and bills. So it's definitely a lot of occupational financial stressors that this population faces that others may not. And just from what we know is that experiencing financial stress and strain, it does have an impact on decreased academic performance, feeling less connected to or supported by the college campus, and increased likelihood of dropping out of college. And if you also think about it, it does also impact how much time folks have to develop those social relationships, to engage in like networking activities, to access the resources on campus and in the community. I hear that a lot from students that, because they're going to school full time and working that full-time job, they don't necessarily have the time to be able to utilize things on campus that close, that are just open from 8 to 5. And also takes a huge chunk of that study time too. And in addition, we know that first generation college students report greater levels of social isolation. So some first generation college students can find it difficult to find a source of community. They can be cultural and institutional barriers along the lines of class that can feel excluding. So one of the quotes that I found in the literature and research was, so when you're walking down the hallways, tags of class, like seeing a really expensive backpack or an expensive sweater, reinforces that isolation quite a bit. So it's not just, being on campus, it's also those symbols of class that students are wearing every day that can lead to that feeling of otherness or not belonging. And we know just also as a mental health professional that social isolation has been linked to poor mental health. And another thing that we notice that's unique in terms of characteristics and challenges that first generation college students tend to endure self-doubt, a lack of academic advice or guidance from family, inadequate writing skills, as well as less access to information, support, preparation, confidence, and money than their non-first gen peers. And another bullet I'll highlight in particular is just the family piece as well. So there's quite a few family transitions that can happen for our first generation college students. They can experience emotional distress related to a sense of betrayal or abandonment from their family. There are changes to dynamics in families that happen, such as decreased availability by the student and perceived neglect from the family as a result. There can also be the receiving of mixed messages from parents and families in terms of wanting their student to succeed, but also not wanting them or their behaviors to be different from the rest of family. And I think oftentimes that can tie into like a misunderstanding of what's the time and the energy and what goes into being a college student. So it's not just like being in high school, it's, you know, taking it to another level. And sometimes that's lost upon family if they haven't gone through that experience as well. One study found that higher levels of achievement guilt, which is guilt associated with differences in a student's achievement versus the achievement of their family academically, it actually resulted in significantly higher depressive symptoms, lower self-esteem, and higher frequency of minimizing a student's academic successes. So we can see that, you know, these family dynamics can actually play a role in terms of a student's mental health and how they feel about their academics and their success. And some first generation college students also endorse guilt related to leaving family behind in poverty. So even if the first generation college students aren't, you know, living a life of luxury here at college, they might be in a much better position economically and living in much better conditions than the family they left behind. And also, I want to highlight the motivations to attend college can look different as well for first gen versus non-first gen students. As one study found that 69% of first generation college students report going to college in order to help their families, compared to only 39% of non-first generation college students who were, yeah, so there's a big difference in terms of motivations as well. And there is more and more research just starting to come out here this year around the mental health findings related to first generation college students. But this was one of the larger studies that I was able to find that has been reinforced by some of the more recent literature and studies that have come out this year. I'd say there has been one difference that these findings don't always stand true when folks have looked at statistics just for their institution. But when we look at the national level, these things tend to be found and true across the nation. The first is, well, this study, let me back up, was conducted in 2014, and they looked at 58,017 student participants. And the first variable they explored was a sense of belonging. And they found that non-first generation college students had a higher sense of belonging to their campus and university, and it was actually lower for first generation college students. When they looked at variables such as depression and stress, they noticed that both were higher for first generation college students and lower for non-first generation college students. And then they looked at help seeking. So help seeking related to mental health in particular. So this, we think about this variable as how there's both attitudes and beliefs. So the attitudes are like how folks feel about seeking professional help, and the behaviors are their actual likelihood to do so. And what they have found is that first generation college students reported needing therapy or mental health counseling more than their non-first generation peers, but were less likely to use it. So they were using it at lower rates than their non-first gen peers. Some of the reasons for why they were using counseling, it was that the location was inconvenient, They shared that they had never heard of it, that the hours were inconvenient, and they felt they didn't have enough time within their schedule, balancing all those responsibilities to be able to do that. And just as a side note, there is a strong connection between a sense of belonging and mental health. So what we know is that a greater sense of belonging is associated with less depression, less stress, and feeling less upset overall. So a greater sense of well-being is a way to sum that up. All right, so we've talked a little bit about like some differences in terms of like risk factors, but like I shared, I think there's a lot of resiliencies and resiliencies and resources that first generation college students come in with that we don't always recognize and highlight. So past research has really focused on seeing first generation college students from a deficits lens, labeling them as at risk, with only more recent studies beginning to explore the inherent strengths that first generation college students possess and have developed from their experiences. A quote that I came across to describe first generation college students, it described them as levitators, as they seem to defy gravity. And I really like that quote, because to me, it means that these are students who are able to rise up despite the forces in place systemically that are there to keep folks down historically. I also like to keep in mind that first generation college students are no less capable than their non-first generation college student peers. They just have had different privileges, or the non-first gen college students just have different privileges, and they're starting the race at a different starting point. For some minority students that we think of, they've actually served as in different roles within their family. So they've been translators, they've helped family fill out forms, they've gone to like parent-teacher conferences in high school to translate, and have helped in like the medical settings, translating symptoms and navigating how to get their parent support if their parents don't speak English or they're not fluent in English. And these actually are students who are incredibly skilled at navigating bureaucracies. And as folks who work at universities, we know that that can be a skill that can really come in handy. So I was reading that that's actually a skill that's very useful and adaptive for some students as they're coming into universities, because they've already had that experience both in the school systems and in the health system, advocating and helping their parents navigate those. Also, for some first generation college students report higher levels of self-efficacy, resiliency that they've developed in overcoming their challenges and their barriers to success. And in addition, first generation college students have been found to be more persistent, motivated, adaptable, and not entitled versus their non-first generation college student peers. And finally, we see that there's tends to be a great sense of pride in first generation college students. So pride in being the first in their family to attend college, and proud of the different opportunities that they feel will come from that experience. Okay. So I'm going to transition a bit and start to talk about some ways of creating supportive and inclusive practices and environments here. And some of these things I tried to be general and broad with so that they could be applicable for both faculty and staff, knowing that folks are in a variety of different roles here. So if you are a first generation college student, faculty, or staff member, or an upperclassman who's present for this, I'd really encourage you to consider self-identifying yourself as a first generation college student in your classes or in your offices. It can be really inspiring for first generation college students to see an example of someone else who's first gen and successful. It can also lead to mentoring relationships, provides an opportunity for you to share connections to opportunities such as internships, research opportunities that you might have in your labs, different job contacts, and things like that. So we know that that can be incredibly important, incredibly inspiring. An example that I use from like my own practice, I have a plaque that I received a few years ago from a previous university that just identifies myself as first gen, and I have it in a pretty prominent place in my office. And it oftentimes serves as a conversation starter with my students who kind of look at it and I see their head tilt a little bit and they smile and they're like, oh, I didn't know you were first gen. And then we kind of have a conversation about that ultimately leads to like, those conversations of not just being first in the family, but to graduate undergrad, but talking about getting a doctorate as a first generation college student, and feeling like that can be very inspiring and very motivating for folks to see someone who looks like them from a similar background or experience able to navigate those systems and able to be successful in that way. There's also a lot of benefits of organizing panels of upperclassmen from different backgrounds that can discuss how they adapted to college life, including how they pursued resources and people to help guide them in their decisions, and helping and how they can engage in conversations with the lower classmen about their specific challenges in higher education. So if you're in like a support office, I really encourage y'all to consider, I know we do that at times, but if there's various ways that we can incorporate panel discussions and sort of that peer-to-peer mentoring, it can be very powerful. And those kind of like low-cost, low-key interventions have actually been suggested to increase retention rates for students. In addition, one thing to keep in mind is how we can include the parents and families of first generation college students. So for many low income first generation college students, they may never see their families on campus. There can be a lot of work and financial limitations that don't make it possible for parents and family to visit or visit often. So by including them in more programming, especially with these opportunities that are coming on virtual, it can kind of help bridge that gap between those two different worlds that the students are living in. Specific programming in this area may be relevant and useful that's specifically focused or highlighting on kind of what parents need to know if they haven't attended college themselves, and how they can support their students. And I know this is an area that many of us are very passionate about, and we've been trying to help with some of that work as well. In addition, encouraging students to engage in cultural community building activities. So encouraging students to join clubs, attending different events on campus to try to build connections. That doesn't just help with like a sense of belongingness, it can also like increase their cultural capital as well. And this is important from a networking perspective, because so much of the job world and those job opportunities are based on who you know. And the more connections you're able to make with your peers, the more likelihood that you're going to have those opportunities down the road when you're job searching. It just gives folks a bit of a leg up in that search. In addition, we want to guide students to register for classes that reflect a balance of their abilities and kind of their limitations. So thinking about if you're working 40 hours this week or a week, do you really want to take 6 classes this semester, or can we space out your academic plan to do 4 classes per long semester and 2 classes over the summer as a way to find more of a balance? And I hear this quite a bit, usually around it's about September or October in the fall, and around March in the spring, where students who have 2 or 3 jobs, they're like holding it together for that first month and a half or 2 months, balancing it all. And then it becomes way too much, too exhausting for them to balance it all. And they end up dropping a couple of classes anyways. So if they were getting that support at the advising level to really find that balance and accept their limitations, if they're going to be balancing all these things, it could help them in the long run not have to take those incompletes or drop those courses and be more successful based on their obligations. Also, we want to consider the provision of money and funding for transition school supplies and emergencies. And so there's so many unexpected expenses that come up for first generation college students that you're not aware of unless you've been through it before. Like I remember, oh my gosh, there's a deposit for everything. There's the fees associated with relocating and actually getting to campus for the first time and bringing your stuff. For the textbooks, the different course fees. Back at my undergrad, there's differential tuition. So it wasn't just the tuition that was on paper. If you were like in business school, for example, they charge additional tuition on top of that. So there was just so many of those things that you can't necessarily anticipate unless you've gone through that process before. So I think being as transparent as possible, but also providing some of that financial assistance can be really helpful for folks. I think about like myself, some of the difficulty, I went to a school really close to my family, and part of that reason was all of those financial expenses. Even relocating out of state would have been really difficult for me to cover. And, just as a little caveat there, I want folks to be aware of our partner office, the Dean of Students here on campus, who they do have some funding for students around emergencies. So something to keep in mind, especially like, I send students there if they're having a hard time paying their rent, they're about to be evicted, those types of situations around emergencies. Okay. In addition, we want to support student writing efforts, and there's some creative ways in which we can do that. So beyond just kind of referring them to the Writing Center and saying kind of good luck with that, we want to consider opportunities to model the writing process for them, all the way from like generating your thesis or your topic statements and how you outline it and how you begin, to considering providing them feedback along the way. So encouraging them to send like a first draft or a second draft of their paper and giving them constructive feedback along that. Not only does that help improve their writing and improve their grades, it also can increase one's academic self-esteem and to feel like someone's really invested in your success and your development as a student. And we also want to emphasize the importance of attendance for classes. So dealing with student absences directly and speaking with students privately about their attendance problems and demonstrating empathy for them by listening attentively and supporting their efforts to improve. Additionally, we want to intervene quickly and early if we notice any problems with engagement or progress that they're experiencing within their courses. So in addition to those individualized conversations we can have with them, we want to also consider those system-wide systems that are in place. So I'm thinking about the pause alerts, for example, that we can use to help support students if we notice they're kind of falling off or there's some changes in their behaviors or their performance. Another thing that's important to think about is to note and be aware of what our expectations are of first generation college students. So low expectations of and viewing first generation college students as passive underachievers can actually lead to self-fulfilling prophecies, both from us as faculty and staff and also from the students who are picking up on that. Conversely, if we're setting high expectations, we're demonstrating that, what we feel they're capable of accomplishing and recognizing their potential. And, they're going to feel just as intelligent and just as capable as their non-first gen peers. An example I kind of use around expectations is from my own experience was back in high school, going through the advising process, pretty early, looking at colleges. And I was really excited, but also really scared because I didn't really know anything about the process. And I actually wanted to go to a somewhat prestigious school and was informed by the advisor, oh, you should consider, going to the state school instead. And instead of like helping me like, hey, these are some ways you can achieve your goals, or if you want to go to this school, these are some things you need to do, I felt really written off and dismissed, like, yeah. And so when I got my PhD, I so much wanted to just take that back and just kind of shove it in her face and be like, I thought I didn't have the potential to do this kind of stuff. But it's little things like that that actually stick with you. And I remember that from, 20 some years ago. So our language and our expectations do matter. In addition, I want to talk about, referring students to the counseling center is needed. So seeking out professional help for mental health concerns not only help students feel better, but they can also make them more efficient workers. So a quote that I came across from an article said, really highlighted this. It says, when I'm feeling anxious, sometimes I have to go a couple hours where I'm not able to get anything done. And so if you think about that, if a student is having like panic attacks or anxiety or these depressive episodes, they might be out of order, so to speak, for an evening or a couple of days. And if that's happening over and over and over again, you can see how easy that would be for them to start to fall behind or for their grades to start slipping. So the earlier and the quicker we can refer them to help, such as the counseling center, the less likely that impact is going to happen over time in their courses. In addition, it can be helpful for us to normalize to students that help seeking is pretty common among college students. So it's estimated that about 25% of college students nationally have gone to counseling or sought help for mental health concerns over the past year. And one of the things that can be helpful is really exploring the potential barriers that are there. Some of those might be cultural or related to gender norm expectations. And some folks might not feel comfortable talking about their concerns outside of family. To counter this, or some of the strategies I use, is I like to take that academic approach and just, I personally bring up like the potential academic benefits of seeking help. And that saying that the majority of college students who come to counseling say that counseling helped them be more academic successful. And sometimes if you put it within the framework of school and grades and academics, it can feel a little bit more digestible or a little bit less stigmatizing for them. And they're less likely to kind of take the bait, so to speak. Additionally, a lot of students tend to have like misconceptions so that they need to be like completely falling apart or having like a major crisis to come into the counseling center, but that's actually not true. We work with students who are experiencing a wide variety of concerns and at different levels of intensity and duration. So anything from family stressors to relationship concerns, homesickness, that identity exploration, up to things like depression and anxiety. And furthermore, a counselor, another misconception I hear is that a counselor has to have the exact same life experiences if they are to be helpful. And we know that's just not true as well. So there's just so much power in having someone who's a good active listener, someone who can help a student like problem solve or brainstorm, or just kind of be a motivating figure in their life. And you don't have to come from the exact same experience to be successful in those goals as a helper. And additionally, like assess for any less formal helper folks within their life that are maybe more culturally appropriate for them to seek help from. So this could be things like a religious figure, like a priest or a pastor in their life who could be helpful as well. Okay, and just another word about sense of belonging and why this is so important. So the greater the sense of belonging to the academic and social community for the student, as well as social support inclusion, the more likely it is that the student will persist to graduation. A sense of belonging has been found to be positively related to mental health when it provides the means through which one is integrated into community, such that he or she feels needed and valued and contributes to the community in return. In addition, social support, it includes direct and indirect roles in the management of stress and the prevention of and amelioration of both physical and psychological problems. So cannot stress enough the power of the sense of belongingness in helping students achieve that. Okay. For this next part, I'm going to talk about the roles of both microaggressions and microaffirmations in building a sense of supportive community here on campus. And to define a couple of these terms, which may or may not be familiar to you, microaggressions are intentional or unintentional brief exchanges that communicate hostility, derogatory or negative slights, and insults on an individual or a group. While microaffirmations are intentional or unintentional exchanges that convey inclusion, support, and appreciation to individuals or groups who may feel unwelcome or invisible in an environment. And I've heard microaggressions described as death by 1,000 cuts. And this, over time, really can lead to elevated levels of depression and trauma. Okay, some examples that I came across in the literature related to microaggressions, I'll go through some quotes here in a moment. But although these, no, let me read those first, actually. During an advising appointment, the advisor made me feel unrealistic and non-capable to study science because I was struggling. He suggested I should major in Spanish. I already speak Spanish. I didn't confront his comments because I felt hurt. And the second quote is, I was completely clueless when I came to college. I struggled and felt extremely alone, and few faculty reached out to me when it was clear I was struggling. And some were actually hostile when I tried to tell them about my background and issues. My mental illness became much, much worse at university due to the stress and lack of support. Although such discussions may appear innocuous, they can actually be isolating and detrimental for first-generation college students who are seeking to connect with others on campus. These quotes highlight how microaggressions demean students' personal and educational experiences and belittle their efforts and academic accomplishments, both before and during college, as well as contribute to feeling out of place on campus. So some pretty powerful quotes there. And let's look at some examples of microaffirmations. So some of the quotes here are, she, the career services staff, took the time to hear about me and my wants in an internship. I felt putting my needs over hers as we spoke. I felt her putting my needs over hers as we spoke. She understood that I had no clue how to go about getting this internship because I feel it is essentially about networks and using your connections. She referred me to connections she had that would ultimately fulfill my needs. And the second one there is, in my chemistry class, my professor said, you know, guys, you all deserve to be here. You are all intelligent, and that is why you are here. Some students had to tackle more issues. We are all in the same race, but some of us had a head start. I really like that quote. Experiences of microaffirmations related to the powerful role validation from college faculty and staff can have in the beliefs of first-generation college students that they can be academically and personally successful in college. They are more than just communications of kindness. Instead, they are intentional and unintentional acts that disrupt the effects of inequality and marginalization on students' self-concept in environments where they may feel marginalized, hopeless, or lost. So what are the implications of microaggressions and microaffirmations? The first is that we want to recognize the impact and the power of our words. And the second is that a critical skill that distinguishes microaffirmations from surface level kindness is that microaffirmations have a deep understanding of systems of power and privilege to determine which words, what tone, and which experiences to use to address students' affected self-concept in college. And third, I really encourage folks to engage in self-reflection because reflections of one's own positionalities, one's own social power and privilege can increase your awareness of implicit bias and also improve conditions for students who may be marginalized on campus. And finally, we want to look for opportunities in one-on-one meetings, as well as in our media and our office's communications on campus, to try to embed as many micro affirmations as possible for first generation college students. Okay. And I think the next part is super important, which is to familiarize yourself with different campus resources that could be helpful for this population. And so this is just a sampling. There's quite a few here at Texas State, but these are the ones that I use most frequently. The first is student support services, which their goal is to increase retention and graduation rates for first generation college students, low income students, and students with disabilities. And they also foster an institutional climate supportive of success of first generation college students, low income students, and students with disabilities. They offer a variety of academic and support resources such as tutoring. In addition, there's the first Bobcat Proud student organization, and that provides students a support system with other first-gen students, faculty, and staff. It helps them connect with the community through community service, resources at Texas State, and through social activities. So if we're thinking about that sense of belongingness and that sense of connection, one way to do that is to encourage our students to engage in that student org. In addition, we just recently had a very successful First Gen Week earlier in November, which consisted of a series of events focusing on supporting, connecting, and celebrating our first gen students. So I want folks to be aware of that happening every year and really advertise that within your classes to show that you are supportive and to help bring awareness of those events to our students. In addition, there's the Brilliant Bobcats, which is a college success workshop series. And so that teaches a bunch of different strategies and skills for college students. There's Bobcat Gold, which is financial coaching and resources and student emergency services, which I've talked about before through the Dean of Students office. There's Cafe, and the Cafe program offers career readiness workshops, financial education events, one-on-one financial coaching, personalized graduation prep, and academic coaching. There's the Minority Male Initiative, which provides academic coaches and peer mentoring for minority males on campus. There's, of course, Slack, which does the tutoring, Bobcat Bounty, which has the food pantry for students, and the University Writing Center, which provides the writing coaching. So there's quite a few resources. I said those are some of my favorites here. I'm going to transition and talk just briefly about the Counseling Center here, since I talked about how important it was to refer folks to us as needed. So we at the Counseling Center, we're a team of professionals that are here to assist students to be successful by helping them address their personal and psychological issues that are impacting their ability to achieve their goals here at Texas State. Like I said earlier, we work with a whole range of problems and different levels of distress. We provide brief short-term therapy, and we see students once every 2 to 3 weeks. And we also have a really highly popular and effective group therapy program. In addition, we do urgent services and crisis response, and we offer consultations for parents, faculty, staff, friends of students that can help have those difficult conversations or help to connect students with care. So I like to advertise this resource. So if you're worried about a student, you're like, oh, I really want to have a conversation with them, but I don't know what words to use. I don't know if I'm going to ask the right thing or not. You can call us and we can coach you through that conversation. Love having those types of talks and helping to see maybe there's some additional resources beyond us that could be helpful to relay for that student as well. In addition, we have referral services so we can help students connect with resources off campus for therapy, as well as connecting them with psychiatry through the Student Health Center. And there are a few things that we can offer. We don't, like I said, don't do long-term therapy beyond 15 sessions. There are some mental health concerns that students present with that require more specialized care or more frequent sessions than what we can provide. And so we do turn to our community partners to provide that care. And different from high school, we don't do any kind of like advising or academic kind of coaching in that sense. Okay, to access our services, this is important because there are some changes related to COVID-19. So we're doing all of our services through telemental health to keep folks safe with COVID-19. And what students do is they should call our office to get started versus walking in. And what they'll do is we'll ask them some questions, we'll have them complete some paperwork virtually, and then they'll meet with a counselor for a consultation to kind of assess what their unique needs are and what their situation's like. And then we'll talk about different recommendations. And right now, as we're getting closer to the end of the semester, we're actually still accepting students in, but we're doing what's called an end of semester appointment, where they get about an hour to sit down with a counselor virtually. And we get to talk about what they're experiencing and coming up with some short-term kind of strategies to help them through these last couple weeks of classes and to get through the break. And there's no additional fees for our counseling services, and everything's private and confidential, which is important if students are worried about, like, you know, if their family can find out that they came or request their records, they can't, that kind of stuff. In addition, for students who are maybe hesitant about virtually starting counseling with one of us counselors, you can always recommend that they take a look at TAO. This can be helpful too for students who have really busy schedules and, you know, they're working all day or they're in class all day. They mostly just have evenings free. Therapy assistance online is self-paced, and there's a lot of support modules for anxiety, depression, and other concerns. And it covers a lot of the same basics that they would be getting in individual therapy. They're just able to do that through that self-paced system. And it's free, and they can do that on a laptop, a computer, smartphone, etc. And it's 24/7. And to get students connected, there is a link on our website. And if you're worried about a student, I want you first to be understanding and show support. You, like I said, can call our office to consult. You can use the pause alert as well. And if it's like an emergency situation, you know, in addition to calling our office, there's a suicide prevention hotline. There's also UPD and the use of 911. So this is just the last slide, which has our contact information and also our social media handle. We are on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. So you all can encourage your students to follow us if they want to, you know, find out about what our office is doing, our services, and different outreaches like this. So I'd be happy to answer any questions for a few minutes if folks have any. So if you have any questions, feel free to use the Q&A function, and I will navigate that. Okay, the first question I received is if there's any suggestions on getting students to follow through with reaching out for counseling. You know, that can be, it can be tricky because there can be a ton of different reasons for why a student doesn't follow through on those referrals. You can simply start the conversation by asking, like, oh, are there some hesitations in you know, reaching out, or, you know, what do you think got in the way? And kind of approaching that with curiosity without kind of judgment there. And that may help you get a sense of whether there's, you know, some fear there or some stigma. Maybe there's different cultural norms related to seeking help. And maybe it's around their busy schedule. Maybe it is around some of those misconceptions. And that, I think getting that information is going to allow you, now that you know more about our center and what we do, it allows you to kind of correct some of those misconceptions. You can also, like, get a sense if they're kind of scared or hesitant. You can provide those statistics of, you know, about 25% of college students actually go to the counseling center at their campuses, and many report that it actually helps them be academically successful. If you've been in counseling before, if you feel comfortable sharing that, you might take that personal approach and say like, I've struggled at different times in my life with different, concerns or problems or anxiety or depression, whatever it might be. And I found counseling to be incredibly helpful. That's one of the reasons why I was really suggesting that for you. It helped me, and I really think it could help you as well. I think, part of the thing too is we have to see our work as planting the seed. So we might not be able to see that seed grow into the tree, meaning that we might not, be there to see them actually come into the office and utilize our services, but we might just be that seed that's planted. And maybe by the second or third time they hear someone mention the counseling center or suggest that they go there, it might take that repetition for it to actually like sprout and then to actually follow through on it. But to know that I think just mentioning it and just kind of planting that seed could take root maybe another semester or later in their progress that we just might not be around to see based on that. So I think also if you have any kind of like personal connection with anyone at the counseling center. So if you know any of us in the office, you can say like, oh, I know so-and-so over there, or I saw Richard present. He's actually really nice. Maybe it's something like they want to see someone who looks like them. So you can say like, oh, they're actually a pretty diverse staff up there. Or trying to put a face to the office can sometimes be helpful too, to make that feel less scary. So are there any other questions that folks may have? Oh, sometimes, let me go back to the other one. Sometimes putting things in writing too. So sending them an email with the information. So like a link to the office or a link to our web page or that phone number can also just be a good like memory jogger for them. So, sometimes students have so much on their mind, it might kind of slip their to-do list, but having that in their email is something that they can go back to, and just, having that link there is just one less step for them to have to research. So kind of creating that path of least resistance for them. Okay. Well, thank you. It looks like that was our question. I really appreciate folks being present for today and being able to present to y'all on this topic that's both personally and professionally interesting to me. And I hope that you are able to take away at least one point from this that you can utilize in your work with students. And I hope that you enjoy the rest of your day, and I hope you each take care. Stay warm out there.